Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 2022 Mid-Season Tropical Weather Outlook. My name is Andrea Berg, and I am your host for today's webinar. I am joined by Jeff Johnson, Nate Hamblin, and Stephen Strum, who will all be presenting today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording the webinar, and so we will send you a link to the recording when it's available, probably within the next 3 to 5 days. If you have any technical difficulties, please send me a message through the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. We have saved some time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you may have. So please do so using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen so our presenters can see it. So with that, I am going to turn the presentation over to Jeff Johnson. Jeff?
Well, great. Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everybody to our updated Tropical Season Outlook webinar. And the three of us will be covering the following topics. I'll start out doing a review of the season so far, what's happened, and then Nate will take the reins and talk about some of the seasonal influences that will help direct the rest of the tropical season and include some model parameters. And then I'll summarize it all with some specifics on the balance of the season. And then Steve Strum will handle the autumn outlook for the next 3 months, and then give some highlights, some hints of what we're thinking at this point for the upcoming winter season. And then we have time reserved at the end for any questions that may come along. So first of all, beginning with a recap of the 2022 season so far, only 3 named storms have occurred in the Atlantic Basin in 2022. No hurricanes yet, and obviously no major hurricanes. And there's been 1 U.S. named storm landfall, that being a tropical storm. And I'll cover that in a little bit. And the damage estimates have been pretty minimal, and nothing too significant has come in. Maybe there will be some tallied amounts a little bit later on, but so far relatively limited in terms of tropical storm damages. And after 7 years in a row where we had a early season storm begin before June 1st, the season start, we did not have that occur this year, so we broke that streak of those early season events. And it has been an unusually quiet season up until now. We're looking at in the lower 10% of normal for this year to date, and very low in terms of the amount of energy produced by all of the tropical activity, especially with fairly weak tropical storms and no hurricanes so far. So very, very unusual up to this point in terms of how this year has gone on. So in terms of storms that have impacted the United States, so we did have an early season event on June 5 and 6. Tropical storm Alex formed. It did reach a maximum wind speed of 70 miles per hour. But this actually occurred after the system moved across Florida. The precursor to Tropical Storm Alex was a storm that developed off the Yucatan Peninsula and then headed northeastward through the Gulf of Mexico and passed through Florida. Did drop a lot of rain, nearly 15 inches in Hollywood, but did not become a tropical storm until it had moved offshore into the Atlantic. So technically not a true tropical storm landfall. Did produce 1 tornado, and damage associated with it was fairly light as far as the estimates go at this time. The second storm to impact the United States was a month later on July 2 and 3. We had Tropical Storm Colin develop right along the shoreline of North Carolina with landfall near Wilmington, barely a tropical storm with max winds up to 40 miles per hour. Again, minimal damage. Estimates are still unknown at this point. There was one fatality due to drowning, and we did have about 7 inches of rain for the top of the mountain near Charleston, South Carolina, and no tornadoes, fortunately, were spawned with this system. So far, we've gotten off pretty light with a real quiet season. Just looking at the historical depiction of when storms have occurred in the past, pretty clear that the peak number of storms tends to be around the September 10th time frame. So we are approaching the peak of the season. It really does tend to ramp up as we move through the latter part of August, through all of September, and then into mid-October at least. So we still have a good 2 months when uh, average season does spawn the bulk of the activity. So don't give up on it yet. Looking at some longer term trends, this is a chart we've shown here now for the past couple of years, but just indicating the number of storms and hurricanes that have been observed over the past century or so. And we did have a little bit of a dip there in the 70s, roughly for a couple of decades, and that was primarily because the Atlantic Ocean was in a colder mode. And we've been in a warmer mode for the last 25 years or so in the Atlantic. So that has helped fuel more tropical activity. Um, Hard to tell how long we'll stay in this warmer Atlantic phase, but kind of running near the end of when it does tend to shift back more toward a cooler one. So maybe a few more years down the road, things will tend to be quieter on the average. We also have seen a lot more weaker storms detected since satellites came into their observational mode here in the late 70s. So a lot of the weaker storms were much easier to find out over the open water. So some of the higher numbers in recent decades are just due to better detection capabilities. In terms of storms hitting the United States landfall going back to 1900, this research report did indicate there is actually a slight downward trend over the last century plus of storms making landfall, and major hurricanes on the right also just that slight decrease. But um, there's really a lot of trends embedded within those long-term trends. We have some fairly active years followed by very quiet years. Um, so overall, we're not seeing um, anything in terms of a big increase, even though it seems like we've had it really bad here the last few years. Now, just looking at some of the hazards that occur with tropical cyclones, which would be tropical storms and hurricanes, I found this interesting map showing the global risk of uh, high winds associated with tropical cyclones. And the wind speed on here is meters per second. You can roughly double that to get estimated wind speed in miles per hour. But if you look at the United States coastline, this model looked at historical records of storm tracks and then modeled that in with the surface roughness and also the terrain to show where the highest risk of high winds would be from tropical cyclone impacts. And as you'd expect, right along the immediate Gulf Coast, through a good part of Florida, and then up the southeast coast into the mid-Atlantic region would be the higher risk in the yellow and red colors. As you move further inland, the hurricanes and tropical storms tend to decrease, so the high wind speeds are reduced by friction of the land and the rougher terrain. Kind of interesting to look at this on a global perspective. If you look at the Western Pacific area, uh, especially Japan and the Philippines, and then the areas from Vietnam northward through eastern China, much higher risk in that area of the globe in terms of getting the really high winds impacting the coastal areas with a greater frequency as well. So just kind of a ballpark idea of areas that are impacted by the strongest winds from tropical cyclones. Another hazard associated with tropical cyclones as they move inland would be the risk of tornadoes. We did see quite a few tornadoes last year that were well inland. This was some report that looked at the locations of tornadoes between 1995 and 2010, plotting their location in association with the tropical cyclone. And you can see that even as the storm moves inland and the main winds tend to decrease from a tropical system, that there is still a risk of tornadoes being spawned a state or two inland from the coastal areas. The blue dots on there would be the stronger tornadoes, F2 and F3, and the red plots are F0 and F1 tornadoes, weaker ones that are generally down more around 100 miles per hour. Still destructive, but those are much more frequent. So even though the main winds are focused with a hurricane or tropical storm close to the coastal regions, you still have that risk of tornadoes as the remnants of the system move further inland. And then finally, another big hazard with tropical cyclones is extreme rainfall. And for each state on here, the maximum rainfall ever observed with a tropical cyclone is plotted. The granddaddy of all is in Texas there, 60.5 inches from Hurricane Harvey a few years back. But most of the other states along the Gulf Coast and Southeast Coast are 23 to 38 inches of rain. So really deluges that can be pretty catastrophic. But even further inland, the remnants of systems can easily produce a foot of rain up toward the Ohio River Valley and even upwards of 8 to 10 inches up toward the Great Lakes region and 10 to 15 inches up through the Northeast. So even though a hurricane might weaken once it comes on shore, you still have the hazards associated with extreme rainfall and tornadoes to be concerned about. So just kind of summarizing some historical factors based on history of looking at hurricanes and tropical storms over the last 150 years. We did have a really quiet period in the 2010 to 2009 period. Very few storms made landfall, even though there were quite a few out in the Atlantic. We were kind of lucky during that decade. So you may have kind of developed a sense of that was normal as we don't get hit that much. Between October 2005 and 2017, there were no major hurricanes that landed in the U.S., and that was a record span by quite a bit to go 12 years without a major hitting the U.S. But since 2017, we have had 5 majors, so we're making up for lost time, and some of those have been some pretty major hurricanes making landfall in recent years. And the impacts from a storm of sufficient intensity, if you put it in exactly the wrong spot, can cause some pretty extreme disruptions, such as Hurricane Sandy and Harvey did when they came into major metropolitan areas. And if we see the landfalls and intensities match up more with those long-term historical distributions, we're going to see that the costs are much greater because we've had a really major growth in coastal areas and increasing the land exposure that's developed, vulnerable infrastructure we have in place, and also the wealth of property. So if we have a storm that might have occurred in 1940 and comes inland, it's going to do a lot more due to those changes that we've had in recent decades. And especially if you put a landfall in a very dense population infrastructure, that really increases the threat for widespread property damage and loss of life. So very important to heed any warnings and advisories. We've been really good about minimizing losses of life in recent decades. And also something to keep in mind, we've seen some heavy rainfall events as storms more recently have tended to stall out either near the coast or just inland, producing some of those real excessive rainfall totals. So keep in mind those flooding risks as being something associated with tropical activity. So that's kind of looking at the big picture in terms of historical perspectives. and what we've had so far in this quiet 22 season. And now Nate will let you know what we're thinking is going to happen going forward. So take it away, Nate.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that historical context and some information that will help put this upcoming forecast into context. But first and foremost, let's look at important historical or seasonal factors. And tropical development is enhanced when ocean temperatures are warmer than average, so warm water gives tropical systems fuel. And vertical wind shear, or the change of wind with height, is weaker than normal. So if you have different directions or different speeds aloft versus near the surface, that gives you more shear, whereas the winds are more uniform, that is less shear. So less shear it has, the more organized these systems can become. And it does help a lot if you have large scale rising motion present over the region that can assist storms in becoming more organized. And taking a look at the main development region, basically from the coast of Africa through the Caribbean is where a lot of the storms like to form during the peak part of the hurricane season. And if you take the conditions we just talked about and place them over the main development region, and then you take waves that come off of Africa during the West African monsoon, so if you get stronger and wetter and more waves, they come over that favorable Atlantic, that gives them a better chance of developing as if you have other conditions present. As usual, let's take a look at the main seasonal drivers, and persistent La Nina will be in place. That's not going to change. And in fact, it's going to intensify a little bit through the hurricane season. A negative phase of the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and basically what that means is that you'll have all kinds of warm water across most of the North Pacific with some cooler water up against the west coast of the United States. In the positive AMO phase, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation tells you have warm water in place across most of the Atlantic Ocean. So what we'd like to do is to go through the historical record and look for years that have similar configurations to this that can give us some clues as to what is coming during the upcoming season. So let's focus in on Enso for just a moment. And Enso makes a pretty big difference when it comes to the number of storms that occurred over the Atlantic Basin. So if you look at named storms, hurricane, and major hurricanes, and let's focus on all years since 1995, since things have changed since 1950. And if you look at how I've broken down, you have El Nino, neutral, and La Nina. And if you notice here, for each of the categories, neutral and La Nina produce more storms, more hurricanes, and more major hurricanes than the El Nino year counterparts. So that is by itself a more favorable aspect for more storms. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look into the analog totals here. And if you take a look at the present 30-year historical average, 1991 to 2020, typically get 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes of category 3 or higher. And if you take a look at 1995 plus La Nina years, those averages increased to 17, 9, and 4, respectively. And our 2022 analog average is 18.5, 8.3 hurricanes, 4.2 major hurricanes. So almost on par, maybe a little bit higher than the La Nina years and above the 1991 to 2020 historical average. So let's focus in here over the next 3 months on analog tracks. And what you see here is every track that has occurred during our 10 analog years. And how to interpret this really, you're not going to see that many storms form this year. This is a total of 10 years, but what you like to look for are places that have tracks and places that don't. And there's a couple places that do have tracks. It's pretty busy over the main development region, and there's a lot of recurving storms. So what that means is the storms will come to the west, picked up by something, they'll push to the north and then to the northeast. So there's a bit of a clustering around and maybe west of Bermuda. And then there's another clustering in the Gulf of Mexico. So some of the storms in the main development region are able to go further westward or even develop over the Gulf and then come on shore there. So the Gulf in the recurve section is pretty dense in September. Where it's not dense is along the eastern seaboard. There are some storms in there, so it remains possible, but it's reduced risk based on that. We move forward to October here, and a couple things stand out. One, there's another section of recurving storms. The main development region tends to slow down a little bit during that point, but we do have development over either the Western Caribbean up into the Gulf of Mexico, so there's still a bit of a track density in the Gulf. So the Gulf seems to be under the gun here if the analogs are correct, and then November things quiet down a little bit. So to recap, above average MDR, main development region development, Gulf and southeast threats are more prevalent than with some recurving storms mixed in. And then for October, storms formed in the Caribbean with Gulf threats with some recurving storms still mixed in. And then November, reduced risk of storm formation. So let's take a look at the current sea surface temperature anomalies and see how things are looking. And the thing that stands out is all kinds of warm water in that main development region, all the way from Africa through the Caribbean and especially off the southeast coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. Some cooler water just to the north of the main development region has tempered it just a little bit. That's playing at least a small part as to why it's been a little bit quiet so far this season. And another thing that's been plaguing us is dry, dusty air that has been blown off of the African coast and spread across the tropics. So all that orange and red area you see is where all this dry, dusty area is. And it's been pressed from northeast to southwest across portions of the main development region. And all those grays you see down are where any limited activity has been. It's been pressed way further south because of this. So right now, this image is from a day or two ago. So we still have this to worry about, at least in the short term here, but there is some improvement coming. So as I mentioned, and as Jeff has pointed out, we've had a quiet 2022. So how did this happen? Well, first of all, a big area of high pressure is formed across the Western Atlantic, stretching towards Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, with some lower pressures across the main development region. So what that has done is created an area where northeast flow has developed. And just the image I just showed you before showed you all kinds of dry and dusty air in that region. So that is being taken from there and pushed into that main development region. And on the right, you see surface wind anomalies, and the arrows you see are the northeast winds. So you see the northeast winds across the Western Atlantic into the Caribbean. So all this dry air has been pushed in there, and that is not the usual direction nor speed of these winds. So we've had a bit of shear that's been created as well. So between the dry air and the shear, it's definitely put a lid on the tropical activity that has been able to form thus far. But how's that going to change going forward here? Well, we talked about water temperatures. They're warm now, and the model guidance here through September through November indicates that it will remain that way, with the oranges nearby, with a particular focus on the west of the ocean just southeast, off the southeast coast, and the Gulf of Mexico. And on the right, you have shear forecasts. So where you see the blues, that is below average wind shear. Where you see the oranges, that is above normal wind shear. So the one problem we're going to have is some of the wind shear is still going to be maybe near normal across portions of the main development region in the east. But as we get to the Western Atlantic, and especially as we get into the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeast coast, the model guidance is predicting below average wind shear. So any of these strong waves that come off of Africa, you can survive to getting across that first part of the main development region. Will have a very favorable environment waiting for them in the western half of the Atlantic Ocean. Rainfall forecast kind of backs that up a little bit. We see the greens here over September through November. Portions of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. You have that means above average rainfall, which would indicate tropical systems could cause that. And then look off the East Coast, you can see above average rainfall. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right along the East Coast, but that could even support some of the recurving that we're talking about. The systems might be not too far off of the coast as they turn northward. ECMWF certainly backs that up. So let's take a look at where these storms might track. We'll use upper air patterns as a proxy to give us some clues. And that lower landfall period that Jeff spoke of earlier, looking at 500 millibar heights. So there, you see the little L here across the eastern part of the country with the blue color. That's a trough of low pressure that set up across the eastern part of the country during the July through October period. And airflow around that basically sets up a wall there. So the storms come westward and the low pressure will pick them up, make them push to the north, and then steer them out to sea. And that was a rather persistent feature that occurred for a lot of months of those. That wasn't, of course, exclusively that way, but for the most part, it occurred here, and that protected the U.S. from a lot of the landfalling storms. However, once we got to 2020, things changed quite a bit. You notice there's a high pressure system that pretty much stuck right along the eastern seaboard up to the Canadian Maritimes with a trough that's backed in more or less towards the central part of the country, maybe the Mississippi Valley. So when those storms come westward through the main development region, they're blocked from coming northward, and they have to wait a little bit longer before they make that turn. So a lot of storms were able to make that turn and go northward towards the Gulf of Mexico, and then towards up towards the northeast to a certain extent. But that definitely made a busy season for the Gulf of Mexico. So let's compare that to what's about to happen going forward. And we'll break it down in September and October here, considering we're almost halfway through the season. In September, what you see here is something a little bit different. You see a high pressure ridge that's off of the eastern seaboard, but it's not tucked into the Canadian Maritimes, nor is it connecting to any ridges over the top. So what it doesn't do is when the storms come westward, it doesn't make them keep going westward necessarily. Any kind of little trough that might be in place along the eastern seaboard could actually pick that storm and take it to the north to a certain extent. So it could either take it towards Florida, or it could actually pick it up, take it towards Bermuda, or even further out to sea than that. So that is a recurving. That definitely favors recurving. However, any storms that can make it underneath and not get picked up, they're trying to go westward and pushing towards the Gulf of Mexico. There isn't much to stop them. However, if we go to October, things change a little bit. We have a high pressure ridge over the central part of the country, and the high pressure ridge still going to be off the eastern seaboard. There could be a little bit more of a connection in there than what is occurring in September. So you could still get some recurving storms when the high pressure is still in place. However, anything that can make it underneath, especially anything that can form the Western Caribbean, will probably be pushed right up towards the Gulf. And with that blocking ridge over the top, there could be some slowing storms upon landfall. And that's something we've seen, as Jeff has pointed out. And something can easily happen again, which could lead to heavier rainfalls than what you otherwise might see with these. So that's something, even though it's been quiet, there's indications that we're still going to have to keep an eye out for these major impacts. So let's sum all this up into a forecast. We're going to reduce our forecast to 17 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. And we're going to focus the Gulf of Mexico through the very southeast coast as the elevated potential. And we'll also highlight the recurve potential here from Bermuda northeastward. Probably near normal risk from the mid-Atlantic to the northeast. I think the focus will be on the Gulf this time. And we took a look at some statistics here. Even though it's been this quiet of storms, there have been several years that have produced many storms after September 1st. So just because we're quiet so far doesn't necessarily mean we're out of the woods just yet. The next 3 weeks here will definitely tell the story. And if it continues to run on the quiet side, then we might have to reduce the forecast even more. But there are some stretches here, some years where it can go on pretty decent runs during September and October. So like I said, not out of the woods just yet. We're going to have to keep our guard up here for at least another 6 to 8 more weeks. Our storm names here, we've used Alex, Bonnie, and Colin. We haven't used much in a long time. It's been since July, early July, since we've had to worry about this. But I think here over the next few weeks, we're going to start using a few more of these here, and hopefully we don't have to get into the supplemental list. So short-term tropical conditions. And looking out there, it's not very favorable. There's not much going on. There is Invest 90L that is struggling with the dry air and shear over the tropical Atlantic. So that'll push to the west over the next few days with lower risk of development. But looking at tropical storm potential for week 1, that's pretty much what it shows. You can see that invest moving west-northwestward. But then week 2 is these tropical storm probabilities light up. So you can see the recurving potential there, and then a little bit in the Gulf potential for week 2. So this is getting into the first week of September. And then week 3, pretty good chances across the Atlantic with the idea here is that the storms come westward and recurve, and then there's some risk in the Gulf. So that kind of matches what the analogs are showing. Then week 4, there's still decent risk here. So the ECMWF is suggesting that this season is going to pick up in earnest here starting week 2. And that's right in line with the climatological peak of the season of September 10th. That's sometime during week 3 here. So still a lot of time left to keep things, to get things going. So the key messages here are conditions are favorable for a very active September and October period. Sea surface temperatures are warm enough for storm formation. Wind shear forecasts show weaker than average shear, which is favorable. And that, that's the part that needs to develop because we're not quite there yet with the current conditions. Analog upper air patterns show that Atlantic storms be more favored to impact the Gulf of Mexico or even the Southeast, with recurving storms mixed in. And the thing to remember is even a weaker tropical system can have significant impacts if it can strike a more vulnerable location or if it can slow down like some storms have in recent years. So we still have to keep our eyes peeled here as we get towards the heart of the hurricane season. With that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Stephen Strum, our Vice President of Extended Forecast Services, and he's going to let us know about the rest of the late summer and fall forecast. So take it away, Steve.
All right. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Jeff, for looking at the hurricane season forecast here. Overall, again, we're looking not just at the tropical activity, but also taking a look through here at the weather as we go through the fall season and even into the winter season. So looking at our projected final temperatures for the summer, it's obviously been a very hot summer. So kind of just to look at where things are at. Most of the country will have ended up averaging warmer than normal, and we're running pretty close here, but it looks like we'll probably end up around the second hottest, maybe third hottest summer of the last 40 years on a population weighted basis. Now, this is actually for the entire May to September time period, so we'll see exactly how September ends up and where we end up in the final rankings from a cooling degree day basis, but definitely one of the hottest summers we've seen overall for the country as a whole. Now, looking ahead to the fall season, we are going to see some continuation of that warmth across, especially the northern half of the country. Now, recently, we've seen a dramatic shift across the southern tier. We've had, obviously, an extremely wet pattern the last few days across Texas. That has ended a extreme drought that had been in place. Dallas went something like 67 days in a row without rain. Now they've had, a foot of rain. But anytime you really wet the soil this time of year, it's really hard to ramp the heat back up with the lower sun angle, the shorter days. And so likely we're not going to see a return to the extreme heat that we saw earlier in the summer for Texas, but areas farther north will likely still remain warmer than normal as we head through the month of September. Now, October is once again expected to see widespread warmth across the country, but there is a risk that we could see a robust cold wave at some point happen this month. I don't expect to see in October that's going to feature more cold than warmth, but even though we are forecasting a warm October, don't be surprised if we do see one of those 4 weeks in there end up colder than normal across a lot of the central and eastern U.S. and produce the first freeze and that kind of thing. So likely we are going to see a impactful cold wave at some point during October that can produce that first freeze, not wall-to-wall warmth the entire month, but overall more warm days than cold days for October. And then the cold risks begin to increase during November across the eastern half of the country. There have been some years that have been similar to this that have seen a fair amount of cold across the eastern U.S. develop during the month of November at some point during the month. And so we'll have to watch for that. A little bit too far away yet to give any firm indication on that, but definitely a little bit more risk that we could see some cold across the eastern U.S. as we head into the tail end of the fall season. Now, looking at the rainfall forecast, the rainfall forecast is highly dependent on where tropical activity occurs in September and October. And so this likely will not verify very well in terms of the details, but this is really more of a forecast of, in the absence of tropical activity, it's going to be drier than normal across a lot of the southern tier. But anywhere that does see a tropical storm or hurricane, we'll probably see flooding and, in excess of a foot of rain in many areas. And so it's going to be kind of an all or nothing sort of fall for the South. We're likely, take out the tropical impacts and it's going to be fairly dry. But certainly, as Nate had mentioned, there's a high risk for tropical activity across the Gulf during the next couple of months. And so depending on where those storms end up, there are going to be localized areas that do see some very heavy rainfall from those tropical systems. We should see the monsoon rains that have been pretty robust this summer across the Southwest begin to taper down after September, but likely that will continue to kind of persist for a few more weeks across that area. So bringing some helpful rainfall for that portion of the country. And then overall looking to see the second half of the fall season, for the most part, staying drier than average again in the absence of tropical activity across the eastern half of the country. Now, again, we have had some severe drought in place across a good chunk of the central and western U.S. The extreme drought across many areas of Texas has been eroded some during the past several days with the heavy rainfalls that have fallen across those areas, at least in localized areas. And so some improvement there. A lot of the monsoon rains have eroded the severity of the drought across the Southwest, and that will continue to be the case going forward. So some steady, slow improvement across that area. But even though we do see a lot of heavy rains with the monsoon, period this time of the year, it doesn't really match up with what you see from the large-scale storm systems that produce widespread rain and snow during the winter season. And the summer monsoon rains tend to be very heavy but very localized. And so in terms of getting widespread drought relief, it isn't really able to make a huge impact in many areas, just again, because those rains tend to be very, very localized. But nonetheless, it has at least helped to alleviate the drought a little bit from what it was heading into the summer season. But certainly with the extreme drought still in place across California, watch for the wildfire risk to increase as we head into the normally windier time of the season in September and into October, when the Santa Anas become more active and that kind of thing. And so that will be a risk going forward for the West Coast as we head through the early half of the fall season, with that increase in wind speed and the existing dryness in place across that area. And then typically as we get into November and the typical winter storms start to increase in coverage and so forth, and things begin to get a little bit wetter, as a result of that, the wildfire risk should diminish across most of the West, except for southern areas of California, which are typically the last areas to see rainfall during the fall season. Now, looking a little bit farther ahead here at our initial outlook for the winter season, there's a lot of interesting things happening as we head into the winter season here. Again, we do have our La Nina here for the third year in a row. Some of those historically have produced some cold, and in general, second and third year La Ninas do have a little bit higher probability of producing colder weather in many cases, when we have similar patterns like what we see in place this year across the Pacific Ocean, at least. And so we are kind of concerned about some of the years that have been similar to this that have produced some early season cold. Certainly from an energy standpoint, that can be more impactful than the cold that takes place later in the winter season. And a number of our analog years have had more cold during that November and December time period than we've seen in recent years. And so certainly, if that does take place this year, that would certainly help to add more demand than what we've seen historically the last 5 years during the first half of the heating season. And we already have a bit of a stress situation in terms of global natural gas supply. So that will be something that we'll have to watch very closely going forward here as we head through the fall season. But our current forecast does favor the southern and eastern U.S. to be warmer than average for the winter season as a whole. And there's still a lot of spread between our analogs and the model guidance. And so this is a very preliminary outlook, but we are forecasting this winter to come in a little bit colder than the last 3 winters. Not quite as cold as the winters of 17-18 and 18-19, but nonetheless colder than the last few years. And again, the risk, there's a higher risk this year for more cold during the first half of the winter season than what we have seen the last few years. And so that would be the notable change. A lot of that eastern U.S. warmth that we do have in the forecast is in part because we are forecasting a warmer February across the eastern U.S. And again, a little bit more risk for cold early in the winter season. So we'll have to see how that evolves here going forward over the next month. There's still a lot of variables that are not in place yet. We don't have Enso fully firmed in place yet in terms of how strong it'll be for the winter season. We look at things, as like ice and snow cover builds up during the early fall. Too early to know how that's going to evolve at this point and that kind of thing as well. And so there's still indicators that we don't really have a handle on and we can't really include in the forecast at this point. So this likely will change going forward here as we head through September and into October. But the early indications do show, again, some risk for cold across the U.S. during the early part of the winter season, which would be, even if we see a similar overall winter as last year, if we do see more cold early than late, that certainly would have some significant impacts on an energy standpoint. So to kind of summarize again, overall, most of the country looking to come in warmer than average for the fall season. But again, that possibility for an increased risk for cold in the eastern U.S. by November and again into December. And certainly with the hurricane season, we're just entering the peak period of tropical activity. And we are still looking to see a very active month of September in the Atlantic basin. And so even though it's been quiet so far, likely still a lot of activity coming up that could be impactful for the U.S. During the upcoming 4 to 6 weeks. So with that, I guess I will hand things over to Nate here, and he can take us through any questions that have rolled in so far.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I think I see a couple here that have rolled in, so we'll get to them. And please, if you have any more, please use the Q&A function or the chat and let us know, and we'll try to get some questions answered here. But let's start with number one. When you look at the sea surface temperatures, do they seem favorable for close-in potential this year, September into October? I'll answer that one. Well, when we look back here and we looked at the idea that there's most of the warmth relative to normal across the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeast coast, that is very favorable for close-in development, especially as we get into later September into October, when the storm origination typically shifts from the main development region towards the Atlantic and even the Gulf, or the Caribbean and even the Gulf. And if you add on top of that the shear forecast, which is forecast to be below normal in that region, that gives us a decent potential for seeing storms show up a little bit closer to the coast. So problem with close-in development is that you don't have as much lead time on that. So by the time the storm develops, sometimes it could be a day or two before it makes landfall. So it gives you a little less time to prepare. So definitely as we get in towards the second half of the season, close-in development will have to be watched carefully. Oh, let's see here. Got one for you, Jeff. What happens if there are more storms than names? How do they handle that? Hoping we don't have to go to that. Hopefully we don't have to find out this year.
Yeah, we had to do that a couple of years ago, I think it was. At the end of the list of names for 2022, I think we had in there the word supplemental. That's another list. They used to use Greek letters, but they, I believe, discontinued using that. So there is a list of supplemental names. But every year they come up with a kind of an average number that they hope won't be exceeded, but sometimes in a very hyperactive year, it does require the use of some supplemental names.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. I've got one coming in for Steve, I think. Does the warming effect from drought conditions extend into the fall and winter season, or is that just a summer thing?
Well, the warming effect from the dry soils is more of a summer than winter thing in terms of helping to build up, or enhance ridges and that kind of thing. But you do still see an impact from that during the winter season, but the impact tends to be a little bit different. Typically in the winter, if you do have drought conditions in place, you tend to see larger diurnal temperature ranges. So you will, if you have a cold wave come down, and it's sunny, and you have basically a clear, weather pattern, you'll tend to see warmer daytime highs than you would otherwise see, but also colder nighttime lows. The soil moisture tends to sort of moderate the temperatures and tends to give you a smaller diurnal range typically. And so that can certainly be something that you will see, where you may have an easier time getting a freeze in the southern U.S. if the soil is dry, with a moderate cold air mass coming down. If the soil is very wet, it can be a little bit harder to get that temperature to actually fall through freezing. You may kind of get to freezing and kind of stall out as the water tries to freeze in the soil and that kind of thing, helping to moderate that falling of temperature. So that's the bigger impact you see in the winter, is just the increase in diurnal range. So the dry areas do tend to see colder overnight lows, but also warmer daytime highs than would otherwise be the case.
Oh, fantastic points. Thank you, Steve. All right, we have another one here. What was our forecast for named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes at the beginning of the hurricane season? Well, our initial forecast was 21 named storms. I think we had 8 hurricanes and 4 major hurricanes. So we decreased our forecast by 4 named storms and 1 hurricane, I believe. The major hurricanes we kept in place, mostly because they can still come in bunches. Statistically speaking, there were several years that 3 or 4 or even more major hurricanes have formed in even a single month from September and October. So we're still under the gun for that. But if we don't get things going here pretty soon, this might be a little bit too high.
And I'd also point out that most major hurricanes occur after the middle of August and not before. So it's actually fairly rare to have a major hurricane during the first couple months of the hurricane season.
That's very true. Let's see, are there any more questions? Looking around. Oh, got one. Got that one answered. I believe we are out of questions here. If anybody has any last minute questions, please let us know. Other than that, I don't see anything. I'll pass it over back to Andrea to close us down.
Thank you, guys. Just, in closing, just wanted to let you know that the recording for this presentation will be sent out to you by probably in the next week. And save the date. This says here, our winter outlook webinar will be scheduled in mid-October. And you will see invites and communications around that starting the beginning of October, around October 1st. So with that, I invite you guys to disconnect and have a great rest of your day.